All right, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Jeffrey Shanks. I'm an archaeologist, historian. I've last 15 years or so, I've done a lot of work on Robert E. Howard's world building. Written a number of articles over the years looking at, in particular, one of the things we talked about in the morning panel today. I briefly mentioned Howard's idea of his sort of fictional races of mankind, the Picts, the Atlanteans, the Lemurians, and the Celts or Nordics. So today I've written some things on the Picts and on the Atlanteans. Today I want to focus on that fourth race of mankind, as he called it, the Celts, the Nordics, gods of the Norse. All right. So I'd like to begin with let's begin with this. Anybody seen this quote before? Know, O Prince. There's been some arguments over whether that should be O-H or O, right? Some of you all saw that debate. Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of REH, there was an age undreamed of. That sons of REH line, right? We're going to focus on that a little bit. Keep that in mind as we go through this paper. So, Howard's Hyborian Age, that most of us, I think, know fairly well. Most people come to Howard through Conan. It's really only one part of a larger fictional shared universe, in a sense, the modern term that we would use to talk about Howard's world building. It's maybe a bit of an anachronistic term, right? Howard was creating this sort of timeline of history and following especially these races of man through time, through his different stories. But it was an evolving process, and I'm going to look at this a little bit in this paper. I mentioned this is something we mentioned briefly in the earlier panel this morning. Men of the Shadows. This was an early Brand McMorran story. 1926, and in this, the bulk of the story is really just a Pictish shaman relating the history of these four races of mankind that we talked about. The Picts, the first race were the Picts, right? And followed by the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, and then the Celts. And we learn of their story, in ancient pre-cataclysmic times. When the Picts lived on islands in the west, that would become modern-day California, the Rocky Mountains. The Lemurians at a lost continent in the Pacific, Atlanteans, in the Atlantic Ocean. But then he also ends this with his fourth race, the Celts, and in one of the earlier drafts, the Nordics, he calls them, coming down from the north, right, and sweeping down and pushing all of the other people, before them, right? And this is a theme that we'll see repeated over and over, this Celtic, Nordic, or sometimes Aryan race, and we'll talk about that loaded term here in a minute as well, right? Here they are. Here's our four races of mankind, right? So this idea, what Howard's sort of borrowing on, and it was actually, I think Rusty was probably the first to use this term in relation to Howard's work, anthropological world building. And for me, as someone with an archaeological and anthropological background, that's part of what Howard was doing that I naturally gravitated to. But when we talk about anthropological world building, I should be clear, we're not talking about modern anthropology. We're talking about 19th century racist anthropology, to be frank, or racialist, even is a more technical term. And what that was, early anthropology was obsessed with classifying humans into different races, right, all over the place. And it was based on characteristics that are essentially pseudoscience, right? Head shape and things like this. These people were dolichocephalic, right? They're round-headed and long-headed, right? Stuff that we know today is nonsense, right? It's pseudoscience. And unfortunately, a lot of these ideas would ultimately be used for horrible purposes, in particular with the Nazis, right? This would be a sort of foundation of Nazi Aryan ideology later on. But this is kind of what Howard is trying to do. He is doing sort of a fantastic racialist anthropology, right? He's also classifying humanity by different, quote, races, right? But they're fictional ones or legendary ones, right? Like his prehistoric Picts are not that's not the real Picts, right? Atlanteans, Lemurians. The Celts are sort of more realistic. Later on, he'll invent his own race with the Hyborians, right? So that this is kind of the way that he builds his world is following different groups of people, and he follows them through time and traces their story through time. After Men in the Shadows, the next major series that he does is the Kull stories in the Thurian Age. Here we have the again the Atlanteans, the Lemurians, and the Picts play a big role in this. But we also, there is a Kull fragment that mentions the Celts, which is kind of anachronistic when Kull, the Thurian Age is supposed to take place 100,000 years ago, right? But even in one of the fragments, Howard, has this final race, right? This idea that ultimately this northern Celtic race is going to kind of come in and take over the scene, right? So let's talk about this idea of Celts, Nordics, and again, this loaded term, Aryans, right? So we today often know the term Aryan from how that came to be used in Nazi ideology and as sort of a white supremacist concept, right? This Aryan race. Originally, the term, though, came from Hindu scriptures, from the Vedas. And it became, there was in Hindu mythology, there was this group, the Aryans, or in Sanskrit, the Aryas, right? Like the sons of Arius that we get in the opening to Phoenix on the Sword. They supposedly moved into India and, in Hindu mythology, and they were sort of a founding race there. It started to become used in the 19th century to refer to the people that spoke Indo-European languages. Okay, and today, even that we don't think of, we talk about Indo-European languages, we talk about the people, they're usually referred to Indo-Aryan, right? But the reference originally comes from the Vedas. The sort of mainstream idea of where these Indo-European people or Aryan or Indo-Aryans come from is Central Asia, where it's believed that they spread out into Europe, into Central Asia, down into India, right, where those Vedic legends come from. But there was also what started developing in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century, sort of a fringe idea about the Indo-European speaking peoples or the Aryan peoples, the idea that they came from Scandinavia or Northern Europe, right? And it was still very much a fringe idea, and it was mostly some of the racialist proponents that were pushing this idea. And you started getting, back up. You started getting this idea of this Scandinavian or Nordic sort of fantastic Aryan race, right, that we know in reality didn't actually exist. It was often tied in with the land of Hyperborea, right, the sort of legendary land of the north, this mythical paradise land that would often end up in fiction. Clark Ashton Smith had a whole cycle of Hyperborean tales. The Hyborian Age itself comes from the idea of Hyperborea. So this is kind of where Howard is getting this concept. His Celts are coming from this sort of fantastical late 19th century Nordicist idea of this Arctic Aryan race, right? What's interesting, though, in some of his stories, we get a more standard view of where the so-called Aryans come from, Central Asia, right? That's the mainstream view. Children of the Night, in here we have it talks about a character who is very unoriginally named Ariara, the Aryan, right? Talks about this is one of his reincarnation stories. He was an Aryan. His people were Aryans, members of a 1,000 scattered tribes, yellow-haired, blue-eyed tribes. A century ago, my ancestors had dwelt in the Great Plains far to the east, right? So Central Asia. And they came westward in a great drift, right, into Europe. So this is the mainstream idea, right, of where the Indo-Europeans, the Aryans, come from. But he would play with that some. With the Hyborian Age essay, 1932, when he starts working on the beginning of the Conan stories, and after the first couple of stories, he starts working on this world-building essay, the Hyborian Age essay. It went through several drafts, and in this essay is when I'll pull this up. Let me read a little bit here. Oops. One second. Let me find this passage. All right, so this Hyborian Age essay, it follows that basic timeline that we first saw in 1926 in Men of the Shadows, the sort of the prototype version for that. You have the Thurian Age kingdoms get destroyed in the beginning in a great cataclysm, and then you have the rise of the Hyborian kingdoms. But then Howard creates this sort of new race of his own, the Hyborians. In one of the drafts of the Hyborian Age essay, or the early draft, they're actually referred to as Hyperboreans, and he refers to this as the Hyperborean Age, right? In the later draft, he shortens it to Hyborian, and Hyperborea just becomes one of the kingdoms of the Hyborians. But those Hyborians, this new Hyborian/Hyperborean race, in this essay, they come onto the scene by sweeping down from the north, right? The same idea, right? The Hyborians come down. Here's the passage from the Hyborian Age essay. Tribes of tawny-haired Hyborians have moved southward and westward, conquering and destroying many of the small, unclassified clans, absorbing the blood of conquered races, and so on. They were swept before them as a broom sweeps debris impartially to become even more mixed and mingled in the tangled debris of races and tag-ins of races. So even his language here, right, has that kind of 19th century racialist anthropology, framing to it. But again, there's this mythical northern race coming down from the north, pushing everybody else before them, conquering him. This is his fourth race of mankind, essentially, right? But then he does it again. At the end of the Hyborian Age, after the time of Conan, after there's another little minor cataclysm, the Mediterranean Sea, comes into being, and the Nordheimer then do the same thing, right? These are the Aesir and the Vanir from the Conan stories, right? We have the blonde Aesir and the red-haired Vanir. At the end of the Hyborian Age, the Hyborian kingdoms are destroyed when the Picts come in from the west and the Turanians come in from the east, right? And they destroy the Hyborian kingdoms. But then the Nordheimer sweep down from the north, right? Again, this northern race that comes in, conquering everybody before them. In this case, they are pushed by the glaciers, by the ice sheets, pushing them down. The exact line in there, Howard, is then the glacial ages begin, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. So this idea of an ice age at the end of the Hyborian Age, it's led some researchers to actually push back the Hyborian Age to like 30,000 BC or something, the beginning of the last glacial period. I don't think that's correct. I think the more traditional idea of the Hyborian Age being intended to be around 10,000 years old is more accurate. What we know now is that there was a last little cooling period that we call the Younger Dryas at the end of the last ice age, and that was really just it had been discovered a couple of decades before Howard, but it was being talked about at the time. There was debate over the idea of like ice ages and interglacial periods and things like that, and so I think what Howard was playing on some of the writings at the time, that as the ice age was coming to an end and was warming up, there was a warm period where things were, becoming better conditions, and all of a sudden there was the last little ice age at the end, right? And so the Younger Dryas, and I think that's what Howard was playing with. That name, the Younger Dryas, wasn't very popular at the time. It was coined right around the time Howard was writing this, but that idea, that last glacial period, was out there in the zeitgeist. Here's just another reference showing the Hyborians, right? That was that quote I was talking about. Here's some quotes about in the stories mentioning the Hyborians and the from Tower of the Elephant. Again, the same thing. New savages drift southward in waves from the Arctic Circle. There's the quote I was talking about in the Hyborian Age, right? Then began the Glacier Ages and the Great Nordic Drift, right? So again, Celts, Nordics, Aryans. He uses these terms more or less interchangeably. before the southward moving ice fields, right? Again, also this idea of the glaciers increasing glaciers pushing people south. So we see in the James Allison stories, they are all, for the most part, set in this period at the end of the Hyborian Age during this Nordic drift southward, right? This new little ice age comes and it pushes these red-haired Vanir and blonde Aesir south and across the world. They start drifting across the world. And the James Allison stories, these are reincarnation stories where the main character, James Allison, in modern times or 1930s, remembers his past life during this Nordic drift, right? Various past lives that take place during here. Here's one of the quotes from Marchers of Valhalla. So long ago that the cradle land of my race was still in Nordheim, right? But the epic drifts of my people had already begun. Blue-eyed, yellow-maned tribes. He's an Aesir, the narrator here. Drifting around the world. To throw this out here, one of the terms in Marches of Valhalla, when when James Allison is remembering his lives, he talks about it being 100 centuries, in the past, right? Or 10,000 years. So the Star Rover, there's a quote in the Star Rover here in one of the chapters. For those that aren't familiar, this is one of Howard's favorite books by Jack London. It's a reincarnation story, right? Have heavily influenced all of Howard's incarnation stories and reincarnation stories, including the James Allison ones. And in one, there is he has a past life, again, remembering back, and we have this quote: "Before I was of the flaxen," that is blonde, right? "Flaxen-haired Aesir who dwelled in Asgard, and before I was of the red-haired Vanir who dwelt in Vanaheim. Long before those times, I have memories, living memories of earlier drifts when, like thistledown before the breeze, we drifted south before the face of the descending polar ice cap." Right? So this is where Howard's getting his idea of blonde-haired Aesir and red-haired Vanir, this Nordic race being pushed down from this Arctic homeland, by the descending polar ice cap, right? The glaciers. So this concept of sort of a homeland in the north, and I know Rusty, you're familiar with this one because we've talked about it. William Warren was a scholar in late 19th century who wrote a book called Paradise Found, right? A study of the prehistoric world. And he put forward the idea that there was this temperate homeland in the Arctic Circle at one time, and that the legends of not just Hyperborea, but Atlantis, the Garden of Eden, Mount Meru from the Vedas, right, was all up here in the Arctic Circle in this homeland of humanity. And it was ultimately, destroyed by the ice ages, and pushing people out. So that basic concept was out there. This work was expanded on by a man named Balgandhar Tilak, and he was a really interesting character. He was an early Indian nationalist, part of the nationalist movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so very early. He was actually imprisoned by the British for a while. And while he was in prison, as sort of a radical, Indian nationalist, in quotes, right, he wrote this book, The Arctic Home in the Vedas, heavily influenced by William Warren, that we just talked about, and some others. But his idea kind of expanded on what Warren was suggesting, the idea of this Arctic homeland in the north. He then compared that idea to what he was finding in the Vedas, right? The stories of that Aryan migration, right? And he was arguing that was correct, that the Aryans didn't come from Central Asia, they came from the north, right? And so he pushed this idea. He was also, it was right at this time when people were starting to talk about interglacial periods, the idea that during the ice ages, they would warm up and then cool again, and warm up and then cool again. And so he was proposing that this homeland of the Aryans was during one of these warming periods in the north, and then a last period of glaciation came and pushed everybody south. Here's just sort of the basic tenets of his thesis in this book. I want to read the summary to you and see if it sounds familiar. It So there was an ice-free interglacial period before that last period of glaciation, during which the Aryan race was living in the Arctic Circle at a much more advanced level, an advanced civilization of Aryans living in the Arctic Circle. And they were more advanced than other Stone Age people, around the world, right? Then from around 10,000 to 8,000 BC, the last glacial period took place, that what we came to call the Younger Dryas, right? And the encroaching ice destroyed the Aryan Arctic homeland and drove them southward. From about 8,000 to 5,000 BC, the Aryans wandered around Europe and Asia looking for a new homeland, right? So this is, in a lot of ways, it's, almost that core idea that Howard had for his fourth race, right? That they came from this Arctic homeland, glaciers pushed them south, they wandered around the world. Now, I don't think that Howard actually read Telok. He was fairly, I say fairly obscure, but he actually did have a lot of influence. The work was actually, it was reprinted in English in about 1925 or so, coincidentally enough, right, when Howard was working on this stuff. But where it did have an influence was on a lot of esoteric, occult, theosophical writings in the early 1900s, of which Howard was dabbling in. And I think that's probably how he came to it. And in fact, it took me a while to, because once I found this, I was like, there's got to be a link here somewhere. But I know he didn't read, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, right? There's no way. It's too obscure. But I did finally find the reference with this man, William Walker Atkinson, who was he was a writer in what we think of today as what we call the New Thought movement, which was kind of what we would call like esoteric Christianity today, that kind of idea, right? Or New Age, what we would call New Age Christianity. He wrote a number of works. The Kabbalion is one that a lot of people, if you're familiar with any occult writings, might know best, although he wrote that anonymously. But he also wrote under the name Yogi Ramacharaka. And he wrote a number of series of sort of self-help books, yoga philosophy, again, kind of what we would think of as proto-New Age type writings. And one of those is, after going through a bunch of his works, and we know that he mentions Yogi Ramacharaka in his letters. His father Isaac had a friend who had a number of these books and shared it with him. Do you remember his name? Yes, exactly. Was a friend. So we know that there's a whole series of these books written under this Yogi Ramacharaka name, a whole set of like these blue-covered books. I've been picking up a few of them, working on that set. But he would have had access probably to that whole set, that library. This one in particular has a quote. It's estimated that the Aryan race is at least 100 centuries. Where we heard that phrase, right? The same phrase he used in Marches of Valhalla. 100 centuries, 10,000 years old at the present time, and some have thought that its teachings were based on those of some still older civilization. From whence the Aryans came, historians are undecided, but the legends indicate that they came from some unknown land at the north. Some have supposed that they came from the region of the North Pole, the former conditions of which region were quite different from present conditions, while others have supposed they were survivors of some great nation whose home had been destroyed by some convulsion of nature. So this may be, I think there's probably a few places, right? We've got the Jack London line about the ice fields. Probably, Atkinson may have been another one, but at any rate, some of the sources that Howard was reading at the time, or at least had exposure to, were playing with this idea, and that's probably where he was drawing on them. One of the things that's kind of interesting, just kind of wrap this up a little bit. In the Hyborian Age essay, right? If you follow it out after the Hyborian Age is destroyed, the Hyborian kingdoms are destroyed, and you have the Nordheimer coming down from the north, being pushed by the ice fields, right? They wander in and they, conquer what's left of the Hyborian kingdom. Some of them go into Stygia, some of them move into the east. One large group of them ends up going into what would become Central Asia, right? And they settle there. And then as you keep reading the Hyborian Age, then they move westward again back into the new Europe, right, after that lesser cataclysm, right? And they come, and he writes in the Hyborian Age essay, they come back in as the Aryans, back into Europe, right? So what Howard has tried to do here, that's the standard version, right? So he's tried to combine, he wanted to have his cake and eat it too with this migration idea of these Aryans or Indo-Europeans, right? He's combined the mainstream idea of them being in Central Asia, but, and spreading into, across the world from there. But before that, they had previously been these Hyborian Age Nordheimer up in the north that had come down, and that's the more esoteric version of their origin story, right? So, Howard, this is the kind of things he did with his world building, right? He would pull snippets from more fringe ideas, but also from more mainstream ideas. He would try to mix them together, creating this sort of quasi-fantastic world, but always with one foot, or at least a toe or two, dipped into mainstream thinking at the time, right? Even if it's dated by today's standards. And again, we often throw out the word verisimilitude, right, with his world building, but that's why it has this verisimilitude, because he would always, even at his most fantastic, he would always try to keep it somewhat grounded, right? So at least you could have that suspension of disbelief enough to believe that this could be a real world and a real fantastic past for humanity. So, and that's one of the reasons why I feel like his world building doesn't get enough credit. He does not get enough credit as a world builder because he was putting a large amount of thought into this. He was doing the kinds of things that good world builders in fiction do today, right? But Howard was doing this as a pioneer. Nobody had really done this before, on the fly, right? And it evolved as he needed. It's not that he created this structure and then stuck to it. It evolved over time as the needs of the stories needed it to evolve, right? The story always came first, right? But he was always creating and evolving and tweaking and working on this kind of larger fantastical prehistoric idea of mankind that he had in the back of his mind. Thank you.